left without a dance. The rejected Omega waited alone until the Alpha King crossed the floor. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Elena Carter. The chandeliers glowed warm above the ballroom, casting honey-colored light across polished marble floors that stretched nearly 50 feet from end to end, and the music floated softly, measured and elegant, the kind meant to make people feel chosen. Elena stood just inside the outer ring of guests, hands folded at her waist, shoulders squared, breathing slow, counting the rhythm the way she had learned to do whenever eyes lingered a little too long. Around her, laughter chimed, shoes whispered across stone, and names were called in pairs, one after another, like gentle bells announcing belonging. Elena wore a simple ivory dress that brushed her calves, nothing extravagant, nothing to draw attention, and yet the quiet around her grew louder with every passing minute. When the first set of couples moved onto the floor, she stayed where she was, offering a polite smile when someone glanced her way, the kind of smile that says I'm fine, truly, even when the air feels thinner. She had arrived on time, as she always did, had followed every rule, as she always did, and still the space beside her remained open, a careful distance others seemed to respect without being asked. The music shifted, inviting, hopeful, and Elena felt the familiar prickle at the back of her neck as conversations dipped into whispers, not cruel, just certain, as if the outcome had been decided long before the doors opened. She adjusted the small silver clasp at her wrist, a grounding habit, and reminded herself to stand tall, to keep her chin level, to remember that dignity was not something granted by invitation. From across the room, the elders nodded to one another and gestured subtly for the tempo to continue, the program moving forward as planned, and Elena understood the message without anyone needing to say it out loud. The dance would go on. She would wait. She did not leave, though she could have, did not hide behind a column or retreat to the balcony. She stayed, feet planted, eyes steady, refusing to shrink into the margins. The floor filled, dresses turning, laughter rising, and Elena remained alone, a quiet island in a bright sea, feeling the weight of being seen and unseen at the same time. At the far end of the hall, beyond the sweep of silk and sound, Dominic Hale watched with a stillness that drew no attention yet missed nothing. The Alpha King had arrived without ceremony, his presence known more by the way the room seemed to hold its breath than by any announcement. He had listened, observed, measured the distance between rules and fairness, and when the music slowed again, he stood. Chairs shifted, conversation stalled, and though Elena had not yet looked up, something changed in the air, a subtle pull that made her heart pause, as if the room itself had turned to face what was about to happen. Dominic Hale did not rush, and that alone unsettled the room more than any command could have, because when an Alpha King moved without haste it meant the choice had already been made. Elena felt it before she saw it, a subtle shift like pressure changing before a storm, the music thinning, conversations dissolving into a hush that traveled across the marble floor. She lifted her gaze slowly, not out of hope but awareness, and watched as the space between her and the center of the hall began to open, guests instinctively stepping aside, dresses swaying, polished shoes pausing mid-step. Dominic crossed the floor with measured strides, the distance closing yard by yard, his dark suit catching the chandelier light in quiet flashes, his expression calm, unreadable, as if the noise and judgment of the room belonged to another world entirely. Elena's heartbeat counted his steps, not racing, just steady, the way it had learned to be when expectations disappointed but self-respect refused to bend. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint crease at his brow, the attentive focus in his eyes, the rest of the ballroom felt impossibly far away, like sound carried underwater. He did not speak at first. He simply offered his hand, palm open, not demanding, not performative, but certain, an invitation given in full view of everyone who had already decided she would be overlooked. A breath passed, then another, and Elena realized the silence belonged to her now, that whatever happened next would echo longer than any music. She placed her hand in his, her fingers cool against his warmth, and the contact felt grounding rather than overwhelming, a quiet acknowledgement instead of a claim. The band resumed, softly at first, as if testing whether the moment would allow it, and Dominic guided her forward with an ease that suggested he had always intended to be there, that this crossing of the floor was not an interruption but a correction. As they moved, Elena caught glimpses of faces she knew well, surprise softening into uncertainty, whispers fading into something closer to respect, and she did not look away. She did not need to. Her posture stayed straight, her steps sure, every motion saying what words never had the chance to. Dominic leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear, telling her she was doing well, that the rhythm was simple, that she could follow or lead as she preferred, and the kindness in that choice mattered more than the attention surrounding them. They reached the center of the floor, where the light was brightest, and for a moment Elena felt the weight of being fully seen, not as a symbol or an exception, but as herself, present and unhidden. She breathed in, steady, and allowed herself to move with the music, to trust the space he had made without asking her to change. Around them, the dance continued, but something fundamental had shifted, an unspoken rule rewritten in real time. And as Dominic met her gaze, not above her or past her, but directly, Elena understood that this was not rescue and not charity. It was recognition, deliberate and public, and it changed the way the room would remember her long after the music ended. The dance carried them through another slow turn, and Elena noticed how the room no longer felt like it was pressing in on her, but leaning back, as if giving space where none had existed before. Dominic adjusted his pace subtly, matching her stride without comment, letting her set the rhythm when she hesitated and supporting it when her confidence returned, and that quiet awareness made the moment feel steady instead of overwhelming. Around them, conversations began again in low tones, curiosity replacing certainty, eyes following not just him but her, measuring what they had missed. Elena caught a glimpse of her reflection in the tall mirrored panels along the wall and barely recognized the woman standing there, not because she had changed, but because the way she was being seen had. She was still herself, still the Omega many had dismissed, but now the dismissal no longer defined the frame. Dominic spoke again, his voice calm, telling her that the floor was crowded because people often followed rules without questioning who those rules served, and she understood that he was not just talking about the dance. She responded honestly, saying she had learned to wait because waiting was safer than expecting, and he nodded, not with pity but understanding, as if the admission carried weight rather than weakness. As the music swelled, another pair nearly collided with them, then quickly corrected course, offering polite apologies that felt new, unfamiliar in their consideration. Elena felt the shift ripple outward, subtle but undeniable, and for the first time she wondered how many others were recalculating what they thought they knew. Dominic guided them toward the edge of the floor as the song drew to a close, not pulling her away but allowing the movement to end naturally, and when the final note faded, he did not release her hand immediately. The pause was brief, respectful, but it held attention all the same, and Elena felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest, the kind that comes when something important has been acknowledged aloud without words. Applause followed, restrained but sincere, and she met it with a composed nod, refusing to shrink or perform gratitude for a moment that should have existed without permission. Dominic finally let go, stepping half a pace back, giving her space even as his presence remained steady beside her, and he asked if she was comfortable staying a while longer or if she preferred to step outside where the night air was cooler. The choice was hers, clearly and deliberately, and she chose to stay, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she no longer felt like leaving was the only way to preserve herself. They stood together as the next song began, watching the floor fill again, and Elena noticed how people now made room for her without being asked, how greetings sounded less forced, how assumptions softened into questions. Dominic introduced her to a few guests by name, not as an exception or an explanation, simply as Elena, and each introduction felt like another thread rewoven into place. When someone commented on her patience, she smiled and said patience was not the same as acceptance, and Dominic's quiet laugh beside her told her he had heard exactly what she meant. The night continued, not transformed into something perfect, but corrected enough to feel honest, and as Elena stood there under the warm lights, she understood that this was not the end of being overlooked, but it was the end of standing alone while it happened. As the evening wore on, the ballroom settled into a calmer rhythm, the earlier tension dissolving into a hum of conversation and measured music, and Elena found herself noticing details she had missed before, the faint scent of polished wood, the soft echo of footsteps, the way light shifted as the chandeliers dimmed slightly to signal the night's slow turn. Dominic remained nearby without hovering, close enough to offer quiet reassurance yet distant enough to let her choose her own pace, and that balance mattered more than she expected. When an older woman approached, her expression cautious but sincere, Elena listened as she spoke about tradition and habit, about how easy it was to follow what had always been done, and Elena replied gently that ease did not always equal fairness, her voice steady, her words simple, and the woman nodded as if hearing something she would carry home. Dominic watched these exchanges with calm attention, not intervening, not steering, trusting Elena to speak for herself, and that trust felt like another kind of invitation, one that did not depend on music or movement. They eventually drifted toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the courtyard, where the night air pressed cool against the glass and the noise softened enough to breathe. Elena rested her hands lightly on the window ledge, grounding herself, and Dominic asked if the evening had been harder or easier than she expected. She considered the question carefully, then said it was both, because being seen could feel as exposing as being ignored, just in a different way. He accepted the answer without trying to correct it, saying that visibility came with responsibility, not obligation, and she appreciated the distinction. Outside, the courtyard lights traced familiar paths along stone walkways, and Elena realized how many nights she had walked those same paths believing she was invisible, believing her presence did not alter the shape of the world around her. Tonight challenged that belief, not because someone powerful had noticed her, but because she had remained herself when it happened. A younger guest approached hesitantly, offering a polite greeting and a question about the dance, and Elena answered with a small smile, recognizing the curiosity not as intrusion but recalibration. Dominic stepped away briefly to address another matter, leaving Elena alone without feeling abandoned, and she noticed how different that solitude felt now, no longer heavy, no longer sharp. When he returned, he asked if she would like to join him for a final walk through the hall before the night concluded, and she agreed, not out of obligation but interest. As they moved, Elena felt the subtle shift of authority around him, how conversations adjusted, how people listened more closely, and she understood that power could be quiet without being absent. He spoke about responsibility, about how leadership required paying attention to the margins, not just the center, and Elena replied that those at the margins often learned to see everything because they had to. Their words met without conflict, different perspectives aligning rather than competing, and that alignment felt rare. Near the entrance, as guests began to depart, Dominic paused and asked if she would be comfortable returning another evening, not as an expectation but an open question, and Elena felt the weight of choice settled gently rather than pressed down. She said she would consider it, honestly, because consideration was something she had earned. When they finally parted, the hall quieter now, Elena stepped outside into the cool night, drawing her shawl around her shoulders, and she walked away with a steady gait, not looking back, carrying with her the understanding that dignity did not need to be granted to exist, but recognition could amplify it, and tonight had done just that. The days that followed carried the quiet aftermath of a moment that could not be undone, and Elena felt it in small ways before she saw it outright. In the pause before greetings, in the reconsidered glances, in the careful politeness that replaced dismissal. She returned to her routines with the same steadiness she always had, walking familiar paths through town, stopping by the market, offering help where it was needed, and yet the air around her seemed newly alert, as if the world had adjusted its focus by a few degrees. People spoke to her more directly now, some with curiosity, some with restraint, and she answered each interaction on her own terms, refusing to shrink or perform gratitude for a respect that should have been present all along. When invitations arrived, subtle and informal, she considered them carefully, accepting some, declining others, learning that choice could be exercised without apology. Dominic did not appear immediately, and Elena appreciated that more than she expected, because it told her the dance had not been a summons but a statement, one that did not require constant reinforcement. When they did meet again, it was in daylight, in a public square where children played and vendors called out prices measured in dollars and cents, the ordinary noise grounding the extraordinary shift that had taken place. Dominic greeted her with the same calm attentiveness, asking about her week, listening fully to her answers, and she noticed how different conversation felt when it was not angled toward justification. They walked together at an unhurried pace, discussing small things at first, the weather, the town's upcoming events, the way routines could be comforting without becoming confining, and Elena found herself speaking more freely than she had expected, not because she felt protected, but because she felt respected. As they passed familiar faces, reactions varied, some warm, some cautious, some quietly resentful, and Elena held her posture steady through all of it, understanding that not every shift happened at the same speed. Dominic acknowledged the tension without feeding it, saying that change often unsettled those who relied on predictability to preserve their standing, and Elena replied that predictability had rarely worked in her favor, but she understood why others clung to it. Their words met evenly, neither trying to claim the higher ground, and that balance made the walk feel purposeful rather than symbolic. Later, as the afternoon light slanted across storefront windows, they paused near a bench, and Dominic asked her what she wanted next, not in terms of expectation or role, but intention. The question surprised her with its simplicity, and Elena took her time answering, saying she wanted space. To define herself without reaction, to be present without being positioned. He nodded, not promising ease or agreement, but acknowledging the legitimacy of the desire. News traveled quickly, as it always did, and whispers followed them, reshaping stories into speculation. But Elena had learned the difference between being talked about and being spoken for, and she guarded that distinction carefully. When someone approached to challenge the change, their tone edged with old certainty. Dominic did not intervene, and Elena addressed the concern herself, stating calmly that inclusion was not a favor but a correction, and that silence had never meant consent. The exchange ended without escalation, leaving behind a hush that felt thoughtful rather than sharp. As evening approached and they parted again, Elena felt the familiar pull of solitude, but it no longer carried the weight of exclusion. It felt chosen, intentional, a space where she could consider the road ahead without pressure. She understood that what had begun on the ballroom floor was not a single act of recognition, but the opening of a path that would demand consistency, courage, and clarity. And as she walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, she knew that the next turning point would not be announced by music or movement, but by a decision that would ask her to step forward again, not because someone had crossed the floor, but because she was ready to stand where she belonged. The next gathering was smaller but more deliberate, held in a council hall where voices carried differently and intentions were harder to disguise, and Elena felt the weight of it as soon as she crossed the threshold. Chairs were arranged in a broad semicircle, the polished floor marked by years of measured debate, and the windows stood open to let in the late afternoon breeze, as if transparency were part of the design. Dominic arrived shortly after she did, greeting others with brief nods, his presence steady rather than commanding, and Elena noticed how the room oriented itself without being told. She took a seat by choice, not instruction, placing herself where she could see and be seen, and folded her hands loosely, grounding herself in the familiar calm she had learned to summon when expectation thickened the air. The agenda moved through routine matters first, budgets measured in dollars, schedules marked in weeks rather than seasons, practical concerns that framed the meeting as ordinary, and Elena appreciated the normalcy because it reminded her that inclusion was not a performance. When the conversation shifted, it did so subtly, a question about representation, a suggestion framed as caution, a reminder of tradition delivered with polite restraint, and Elena recognized the pattern immediately, the careful testing of limits without stating them outright. Dominic listened without interruption, letting the points land, letting the room reveal itself, and when he finally spoke, he did not elevate his voice or posture. He simply asked whose interests the traditions had protected and at what cost. Silence followed, not hostile but exposed, and Elena felt the familiar pull to shrink, to let someone else answer, but she resisted it, drawing a slow breath and speaking when the pause invited honesty rather than permission. She said that tradition could offer continuity but not immunity from change, that the cost of exclusion was not theoretical but lived, measured in missed opportunities and quiet endurance, and she spoke without accusation, anchoring her words in experience rather than argument. A few people shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, and Elena felt the room recalibrate, not because she had convinced everyone, but because she had spoken without apology. Dominic nodded once, not in approval but acknowledgement, and added that leadership required correcting blind spots, not defending them, and that correction was strongest when it came from those who had been asked to wait the longest. The discussion opened then, questions asked more directly, concerns voiced with less edge, and Elena answered where she could, deferring when appropriate, understanding that presence did not require dominance. At one point, a familiar voice challenged the pace of change, warning of instability, and Elena met the concern calmly, saying that stability built on silence was fragile by nature, and that resilience grew when people were allowed to stand fully in the light. The exchange did not escalate, but it did settle something, a line drawn with clarity rather than force. As the meeting concluded, decisions deferred rather than dismissed. Elena felt the strange mix of exhaustion and resolve that followed meaningful effort, and Dominic caught her eye, offering a small, steady look that conveyed respect without expectation. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the steps, and they walked together briefly, discussing nothing urgent, letting the weight of the room lift. Dominic asked how she felt about what had been said, and Elena answered honestly, saying that speaking did not erase the past, but it changed the present, and that was enough for now. He agreed, adding that change often arrived first as discomfort before it settled into structure, and Elena smiled at that, recognizing the truth of it. As they parted, she understood that the moment ahead would not be announced by ceremony or invitation, but by resistance becoming visible, and that when it did, she would not step back into waiting. She would stand, not because someone had made space for her, but because she had learned to claim it with clarity and calm. Resistance did surface, just as Elena had sensed it would, not as open confrontation, but as quiet exclusion dressed in politeness. And she felt it during the following weeks and meetings where invitations arrived late or agendas shifted without notice. She did not react immediately, choosing observation over assumption, noting patterns the way she always had, with patience sharpened by clarity. Dominic noticed as well, not because she complained, but because he paid attention, and one afternoon he asked her to walk with him through the outer gardens where paths curved gently and conversations could remain private without secrecy. Elena spoke plainly, saying that progress had stirred discomfort and that some were attempting to regain control through subtle erasure rather than debate. Dominic listened, his pace unhurried, then said that resistance often tested whether change was symbolic or structural, and Elena understood that the test was not just for him, but for her. The next council session made the tension visible, a proposal quietly sidelined, a voice redirected, and Elena felt the familiar instinct to wait, to preserve harmony by yielding space. Instead, she raised her hand calmly and asked for the floor, her voice steady, her posture relaxed, and the room shifted as attention settled on her without surprise. She addressed the omission directly, not accusing individuals but naming the pattern, stating that inclusion could not depend on convenience, and that consistency was the measure of sincerity. The response was immediate but measured, some nodding, some stiffening, and Dominic did not intervene, allowing the exchange to stand on its own merit. When a counterargument came, framed as concern for unity, Elena replied that unity built on selective silence was fragile, and that honest participation strengthened rather than weakened collective purpose. Her words did not escalate the room, but they did clarify it, drawing a line between comfort and progress. Afterward, conversations shifted, some cooler, some warmer, and Elena felt the weight of visibility press in again, heavier this time because it required endurance rather than courage. Dominic joined her later, acknowledging the difficulty without softening it, saying that leadership often meant standing where agreement had not yet formed, and Elena replied that standing was easier than waiting had ever been. Days passed, and small corrections followed, agendas adjusted, voices included more deliberately, and while not everyone embraced the change, resistance lost its subtlety and therefore its power. Elena continued to engage without defensiveness, offering input where relevant, stepping back where appropriate, maintaining the balance she had learned between presence and restraint. One evening, as they reviewed plans for an upcoming public forum, Dominic asked if she was willing to speak openly, knowing the scrutiny it would invite. Elena considered the question carefully, aware of the weight it carried, then said yes, not because she owed anyone reassurance, but because transparency had already cost her enough silence. The forum drew a crowd, familiar and unfamiliar faces filling the space, and Elena spoke with the same measured honesty she had practiced, sharing experience without spectacle, grounding ideas in lived reality rather than rhetoric. The response was mixed but engaged, questions thoughtful, reactions visible, and Elena felt the quiet satisfaction of having met resistance without being shaped by it. As the evening closed, Dominic thanked her not for agreeing, but for choosing deliberately, and Elena recognized that this was the truest shift of all, that her presence was no longer conditional or reactive. Walking home under the evening sky, she felt tired but steady, understanding that the final turning point was approaching, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a moment when recognition would no longer be symbolic but affirmed in action, and when it arrived, she would meet it without hesitation, grounded in the knowledge that she had already crossed the most difficult distance, the one between waiting and standing. The public forum did not end the questions, but it reframed them, and Elena felt the difference in the days that followed as conversations grew more direct and decisions more transparent. What had once been whispered now surfaced in open discussion, not always agreeable, but honest enough to engage. And that shift carried weight. Dominic asked her to join him for a review of proposals that had been delayed for years, items that affected access, participation, and visibility, and Elena recognized the significance not as a reward, but as a responsibility. They worked side by side at a long table strewn with papers and tablets, figures measured in dollars, and timelines mapped in months, the work grounded and practical, and Elena appreciated how purpose replaced spectacle. When disagreements arose, they addressed them without urgency, letting facts and lived experience share the space, and Elena found that her voice no longer needed to be raised to be heard. Resistance still appeared, but it had changed shape, no longer hidden behind courtesy, now expressed through debate that could be answered rather than endured. At one meeting, a proposal stalled again, and Elena felt the old tightening in her chest, the memory of waiting resurfacing, but she steadied herself and asked for clarity on the objection, inviting specificity instead of accepting delay. The answer came, cautious but explicit, and Elena responded with equal clarity, outlining the impact of inaction, grounding her points in measurable outcomes rather than appeal. The room listened, some persuaded, others challenged, and Dominic allowed the exchange to unfold without steering it, trusting the process they were building together. The vote that followed was not unanimous, but it passed, and Elena felt the quiet satisfaction of progress earned rather than granted. Later, as they walked through the hallways now familiar with shared work, Dominic said that leadership was often defined by the moments when power stepped back to let accountability step forward, and Elena replied that accountability required presence, not permission. Their understanding had deepened into something steady, neither formal nor fragile, and Elena recognized that trust had been built through consistency rather than gesture. Outside, the season shifted, evenings cooling, daylight shortening, and Elena noticed how her own routines adapted, no longer shaped by avoidance but intention. She accepted invitations aligned with her goals, declined those that sought to position rather than include, and felt comfortable explaining her choices without defense. When a community event was announced, larger than the rest, designed to mark a new chapter publicly, Dominic asked if she wished to attend at his side, not as symbol or statement, but as collaborator. Elena considered the question carefully, aware of the visibility it would bring, and answered yes, not because she needed recognition, but because she understood the value of being present when change was named aloud. The event drew a wide crowd, the atmosphere attentive rather than celebratory, and Elena stood with Dominic as plans were outlined, commitments stated clearly, timelines assigned. When her turn came to speak, she did so briefly, focusing on shared responsibility rather than personal narrative, emphasizing that progress depended on continued participation, not singular moments. The response was steady, applause measured, and Elena felt grounded rather than elevated. As the gathering concluded, Dominic thanked her quietly for her judgment, and Elena realized that the path ahead was no longer uncertain, simply demanding. Walking home beneath the streetlights, she reflected on how far she had come, not in distance but stance, understanding that the final recognition would not be dramatic or sudden, but confirmed in the way space was held for her without question. And she knew that when that confirmation arrived, it would feel less like arrival and more like alignment, the world finally matching the posture she had learned to keep all along. The confirmation arrived quietly, the way lasting things often did, not announced by ceremony, but settled into place through consistency. And Elena recognized it one morning when she entered a room and the conversation adjusted without hesitation, not to accommodate her, but to include her. The shift was subtle, almost unremarkable, which made it meaningful, because it did not require attention to exist. Decisions moved forward with her input assumed rather than requested, and when disagreements surfaced, they were addressed openly, without the old detours of dismissal or delay. Dominic observed the change with the same calm attentiveness he always had, noting not the absence of resistance, but the presence of structure where uncertainty had once lived. He told Elena that systems revealed their values most clearly when no one was watching for exceptions, and she agreed, understanding that this was the measure she had been waiting for without naming it. The next public gathering reflected that measure, not as a spectacle but as routine, and Elena attended without anticipation or armor, dressed simply, standing easily among peers. Conversations flowed, practical and direct, and when her perspective was requested, it came as naturally as any other, weighed on its merit rather than its origin. She noticed how little she thought about where to stand or when to speak, how the energy once spent on vigilance now moved toward purpose, and that freedom felt earned. Dominic addressed the assembly with clarity, outlining progress and acknowledging contributions without hierarchy, and when he referenced Elena's work, it was without emphasis, as if recognition had become unnecessary because participation was expected. The room responded with steady approval, and Elena felt no surge of emotion, only a quiet alignment, the sense that the world had finally adjusted to the stance she had maintained all along. Afterward, as people dispersed and evening settled in, Dominic walked with her along the familiar paths, the conversation unhurried, reflective. He asked if she felt complete, and Elena considered the question carefully before answering that completion was not the goal, but continuity was, the ability to move forward without being pulled backward by doubt. He accepted the answer, saying that leadership was less about destination than direction, and Elena smiled at that, recognizing how far they had come from the moment of a single dance. They paused near the edge of the square where lights softened and the town quieted, and Dominic spoke then with deliberate simplicity, stating that he valued her judgment, her steadiness, and her refusal to accept less than fairness without demanding more than accountability. Elena received the words without deflection, acknowledging them as she had learned to do, with presence rather than disbelief. She replied that respect grew strongest when it was shared rather than granted, and that standing beside him had never meant standing behind herself. The understanding between them settled into something mutual and unspoken, not defined by titles or roles, but by the consistency of choice. As they parted for the evening, Elena walked home under the familiar glow of streetlights, her pace steady, her thoughts clear. She reflected on the distance traveled, not measured in steps or time, but in the shift from waiting to standing, from being left out to being fully present. The memory of that first night remained, not as a wound, but as a marker, a reminder of where change had begun. Elena understood now that the floor had been crossed only once, but she had crossed something far greater within herself, and that crossing would carry her forward long after the music faded. She entered her home with the calm certainty that she belonged, not because someone had invited her in, but because she had claimed her place with dignity, and the world had finally learned to meet her there.